Hi everyone, my name is Vidyaraman and I'm the CPO for DeepDive Labs. And let's get started today with the session on artificial intelligence risk management. Um, can folks just comment on the webinar chat if you can hear me well, please? And if you can see my screen as well. All right, thank you. Thank you very much. So let's get started today. The session today is the third in the series of artificial intelligence risk management. And the topic is comparing the risk management frameworks and tools, when, what, and why. So let's go ahead and have a very quick recap of what we did in the first two sessions so that we can set context on what is actually available in this particular screen here. The first one is we covered the basics of the artificial intelligence risk management frameworks. This was shown in a tool called Regulatory Experiences, also called Reg Experience. This is a GRC tool and solution that is being developed by DeepDive Labs. So give me just a minute as I switch over and give you a quick review of what was covered in the first time around. Okay, so this is the main screen for Reg Experience. The site is regexperience.tech, and there is a number of compliance tools and solutions here. Today, I'm just going to be focusing on AI risk management. This is what we covered in the first two sessions as well. So I'm just going to give a quick recap of what was available here. As soon as I click here on AI risk management frameworks, I can see two tabs here. The first one is templates and the second one is assessments. So I am in the templates tab where we have a number of AI risk management templates. So the first one is called Responsible AI Architects Guide, and there are a few others as well. For the session today and for the sessions that we had been working on for so long, we had been focusing on three of these specific risk management frameworks, and we are going to just do a quick recap of them. The first one is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. The second one is the ISO 42001 framework. And the third one is the Supervisory Guidance on Model Risk Management. So let's look at the first one, which is the NIST AI Risk Management Framework. I'm going to click on first view details, and you will see the dialog box that shows you what are all the details about this framework. The most important thing here is you'll also be able to see the original URL of the framework here. So if I were to click here, you will be redirected to the actual NIST website where they have a number of these risk management frameworks and a number of other frameworks as well. So this is the first one. So now I'm going to close this and I'm going to click on Explore Template, and we will see how the NIST AI RMF is being shown here. The NIST AI RMF framework, it has a number of pivots, the major of them being govern, manage, map, and measure. And for each one of them, there are a bunch of controls and there is a set of descriptions for what those controls entail. Furthermore, on the right-hand side, if you click on the informational icon, you will be able to see the recommended actions according to the framework in order to satisfy this particular description or this particular control. You will also be able to see the documentations that are recommended here and some other transparency sources and any other references and other informational items about this particular control. Now, what you're seeing here is actually directly available on the NIST framework website. And what we have done is we have taken it and made it into a governance tool where you can understand what the different controls and the descriptions are, along with the implementation guidances. So this is the first one of the AI RMF templates. The second one that I would like to focus on today is in the previous sessions, we talked about ISO 42001, and ISO 42001 is actually an artificial intelligence management system. within this particular AI management system standard, you have embedded risk management, and risk management is encoded in ISO 23894. So again, if you were to look at the details and click on the framework, you will be taken to the website where ISO has their original documentation. Now, I'm now going to close this and look at the actual template for 23894, and you will see a very similar set of UXs here. On the top, you see a bunch of pivots, which is principles, and then frameworks, and then processes. And if you click on all, you can see all of the controls and their descriptions. And as before, I can click on the informational icon to understand what the description is, what are the recommended actions, any relevant documentations, and others. Now, unlike the NIST framework, this is being derived directly from the ISO 23894 PDF document, and this is what we have done from a backend standpoint. So the idea here again is to try and understand what these controls are and their descriptions are. This is what we had covered in the last sessions. And the final one that is relevant for the session today is the supervisory guidance on model risk management. So now again, I'm going to click on view details. And if I were to see what the framework here is, you can see that the framework is a PDF document that is there on federalreserve.gov. This is from the United States government, and you will see what the actual supervisory guidance is as a PDF document. In the same vein as the ISO ones, if you were to click on Explore template here, you again see the different controls and their descriptions. However, the pivots here are different because the specific objective of this particular guidance is for model risk management, which is a subset of artificial intelligence risk management, especially from the NIST standards, so to speak. So here you have model development, implementation, use, validation, vendor management, and finally governance as well. You can see that there are some overlaps, but then there are a lot of differences, especially in the scope. So these are the three ones that are very specific, and this completes our first level recap in terms of what we had covered the last time around. Now, this is the other ones that we covered in session 1. This is around types of risks. The deck had already been shared with all the participants. If you did not receive it, please feel free to contact us. But here in this particular screen, you see the key AI specifics, specific risks, so to speak. And here you have hallucination, bias, drift, misuse, and over-reliance. And there are a number of these specifics in terms of what the example is, what the definition is, and what are the specific risks in with reference to these particular specifications, so to speak. Now, all of these were covered in great depth in session 1. So this is just a mere recap, just to remind us that these are some of the AI specific risks. However, the definitions and the different types can vary based on which particular standard you are looking at or any kind of advancements in the field as well. So this is a very good starting point, and it's probably reasonably accurate as well. But as we go ahead and as the models come, even better, some of these risks might take on different shapes and forms. So the last one that we had covered in session 2 was around the tools. So in this particular case, we had talked about the categories of AI risk tools. We had talked about fairness, robustness, and transparency. And within each of these sections, we had talked about the specific tools like AIF 360, the FairLearn, and then for robustness, Foolbox, and so-called robustness gym. And then, of course, transparency, the responsible AI dashboard, and the AI verified toolkit. So this is what we had covered in session 2. Each one of these was covered in depth. Again, if you would like to have a recording, or if you would like to get the deck from earlier, do please contact us. The other ones that we had also talked about was the comparative use case on when to use which particular tool. So this is again a summary slide for when to use each one of these tools specific to a use case. and then the specific issue that the use case was actually making it clear, or the nuance that needed to be distinguished in that use case. And then for each one of them, a mitigation that was introduced as a consequence of the application of the tool set, and the perceived outcome as a consequence of the application of that particular tool. So this is again a view of what we had covered in the session 2 as well. I will pause here for a quick minute and see if anybody has any comments or questions. If you have any questions or if you would like to talk anything, do please put it either in the webinar chat or in Q&A. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm just going to move on now. So we are now going to talk about a specific concept called crosswalk, and we are going to see what the crosswalk relevance is with respect to the three frameworks that we had talked about, and why it is relevant from a tool applicability standpoint. So a crosswalk is simply what is called a structured map. Sometimes it is also referred to in the industry as regulatory mapping or control mapping or framework mapping. So the idea is that you can translate either a requirement or a control or a recommended activity from one standard or a framework to another, so that you can understand what are the equivalents between different frameworks and what are the gaps as well. So here on the right hand side, you see one particular example. So let us take as an example the domain of bias and fairness. So in the NIST AI RMF, you will be able to look into it into the particular pivot that we talked about as measure. And here in the ISO 23894, we'll be able to see it in a clause 6.4, which is in Annex A about fairness. Finally, in SR 11, the supervisory guidance that we just saw, we will be able to see it specifically under the model validation, the outcome analysis, and the monitoring. So what is the relevance of a crosswalk and why is it important here? Let us assume that you are starting off with one particular framework, and you had started off with, let us say, the NIST AI RMF, and you have gone through all the pivots and you have satisfied in some measure all of the requirements that are specified there. Now, if you want to, for example, satisfy the requirements in ISO 23894 or in SR 117, the idea is to minimize the actual work that is being done, specifically the redundant work that needs to be done. So instead of going through ISO 23894 from scratch or SR 11 from scratch, what you would want to do is reuse the work that you had already done in NIST AI RMF. However, and now let us just look into the reg experience so that I can show it as a specific illustration here. So we talked about the NIST AI RMF, and here we have govern, manage, map, and measure. So for all of these measurements, you have a bunch of requirements. For example, the approaches and metrics for measurements of AI risk enumerated during the map function are selected for implementation. And then this particular requirement is a bit more specific, and there are some specific guidances in terms of what actions to take. Now, assuming that this particular control and this particular requirement as specified by this description has already been satisfied and you had conducted an assessment, it would be ideal if you can understand whether this equivalent of measure 1.1, this particular description, is also being asked for in another of these frameworks, specifically in, let us say, 23894. So in 23894, again, we have the principles, the frameworks, and the processes. And inside the processes, you might have something like, for example, defining the risk criteria or identification of assets and their values and identification of specific consequences and likelihood. So the idea here again is to take the specific requirements that are there in one particular framework, the NIST AI RMF, and then map it to the ones in ISO controls, so that the work that has been done in order to satisfy a requirement in NIST can be reused for the work that needs to be done in the ISO framework. So that is the purpose and the utility of a crosswalk, so to speak. Again, we'll just look into it a bit just to recap. The crosswalk is the structured map, so it translates the requirements or the controls from one particular framework to another, and it enables reuse of controls across each of these frameworks. More specifically, it enables reuse of that particular evidences or proof that you have adhered to a control. It has all these specifics in terms of the intent semantics, and more specifically, the mapping from one particular requirement in framework 1 to another requirement in framework 2. And the mapping can either be one-to-one or it can be one-to-many. So this is a crosswalk. Now, the relevance of this particular crosswalk here is we are now going to look at the ISO 23894 tool categories and see how we can very, very broadly map it to the NIST AI RMF functions. So going back to the NIST AI RMF functions, we had govern, map, measure, and manage as the top 4 pivots there. In ISO 23894, we have a number of these other clauses. For example, clause 5 will talk about frameworks, leadership, integration, and others, which closely maps to the notion of governance. Now, I must caution that this is a summary slide. The specifics of a crosswalk really is looking at all the specific controls of govern and then taking them each of them one by one and mapping it to all the specific clauses in clause 5 in Annex A for ISO 23894. So that is the true definition of a crosswalk, which is very close to the metal. The idea here is to do a very, very broad category level equivalence so that we can then understand what are the key tool categories that are going to be mapped to each of these top level categories or the pivots here. So in this particular case, for the NIST AI RMF function, we have govern that is now mapped to clause 5 in 23894. And the key tool categories that we would be doing or using in this particular cases, we would have some sort of a governance dashboard, an accountability register, policy repositories, and audit trails as well. The audit trails, for example, will help in trying to understand what is the accountability in terms of the actions that have been taken there. In a similar manner, let us move on to the third one because it's a bit more closer to what we had covered in section 2, the measurement category here. So the measurement category in ISO 23894 is mapped to 6.4, where we talk about risk assessment, specifically around fairness, privacy, robustness, and safety. As we discussed in section 2, all of these are common themes that are sort of covered across most of the frameworks, but then each of them focus on a very different pivot or a different perspective based on their particular requirement. So the key tool categories in this particular case would be any of the bias or the fairness tools, any explainability libraries, and the robustness or security testing tools as well. Now, what are these tools? I am now going to go back to our recap just so I put this in context where we talked about the categories of AI risk tools. So here we have covered the notion of fairness, robustness, and transparency. And these were the tools that we discussed in session 2. So what this particular crosswalk is now telling us is very simply that if you were to have the NIST AI RMF functionality and you had the measure category, that would be mapped to the ISO 23894 clause 6.4. And in order to try and satisfy that particular huge set of clauses or that particular set of requirements, you would then use the key tools which are related to bias, fairness toolkits, or explainability. And those specifics are what we just saw in terms of AIF 360 or any of the other tool sets there. Now, the last ones and the second one, map and manage, are also on a similar notion. So for example, in map, we want to try and understand the scope, context, and criteria in terms of ISO 23894. And in that particular tool category, you would have a tool that would try to understand what the AI inventory is, the stakeholder mapping, the risk source catalog, impact assessment templates, and others. Now, I want to take a pause here to very clearly delineate what does it mean to have different tool categories versus tools. So let us just take, for example, row 2 map and row 3 measure, and let us do just the mapping around AI inventory. What does mapping around AI inventory mean? It simply means that you want to look at your entire organization and then take an inventory of all the products or the touch points or APIs or what have you, where you are using some sort of AI. And then for all of those touch points, you want to put an inventory of what exactly is the nature of the AI technology that is being used. For example, you could have a recommender system for which you are trying to take as input some past data, and then you're applying a machine learning model and getting some output. That would constitute an AI system one, and that would be system one inventory. Another system where you could use is actually make a direct API call to OpenAI or maybe Anthropic or Google Gemini. And then you could take the output that those large language models are giving you and then making them a bit more different based on your use case. Now, this would constitute an AI system 2, that would be AI inventory for system 2. So AI inventory in this very specific case simply means that you want to look through your entire organization and get an inventory of what all AI systems are available and how they are being used, their context and others. And then for each of these AI inventory, each of these AI systems that are there in your inventory, you want to now go ahead and understand whether they are biased, whether they are fair. Are you able to explain it? What is their impact in terms of what would happen if they failed or they had something bad coming out? And do you have a human in the loop and others? So this is the overall picture. With this particular context, if you now look at the notion of an AI inventory, the notion of an AI inventory tool can range from anything as simple as having an Excel file with all of the names of the AI systems that you have, a description and others, and then taking them in terms of their particular location inside the organization and some other metadata. But the point is the tool can be very simply put Excel sheet, or depending on the maturity of the organization, it can be something inside SharePoint, or it can be a list within some other nice fancy tool, or it could be an actual GRC solution as well. So it could be any one of these. So this is what we mean by saying when you have this particular AI RMF function map, you map it to clause 6.3, and then in order to execute on the requirements in those particular clauses, you would then go ahead and have a tool that would measure or that would get an inventory of all of the AI systems that you have. And this can be expanded to stakeholder mapper, risk source catalog, impact assessment templates. Impact assessment templates can be a very clear Microsoft Word document with all of the required fields for impact assessment. And you can take it further in terms of any other impact assessment dimensions that you want to add in there. So with this said, I will pause here just for a minute to see if there are any questions or comments in the webinar chat or Q&A. Okay, I'm going to move on. If you have any questions, do please feel free to put them on the chat or Q&A here. So moving on now, we talked about the crosswalk from 23.894 to AI RMF. Let's now expand it to SR11 here. So SR11, as we very briefly talked about, let's actually go back so that we have a good context on what SR11 is, and then we will be able to understand what it means to have a mapping here. So this is the SR 11.7 attachment, the supervisory guidance. And as you can see, it is a huge PDF document with a lot of text which explains what is being done and which also talks about model development, implementation and use and some specific requirements around it. Reg Experience has been able to take this particular SR11, which is oh, okay. So let's look at SR. Okay, so this is the supervisory guidance SR11, which is present in Reg Experience, and it has been able to pivot it into model development, implementation, model use, validation, vendor management, and governance. Now, let us for now focus only on the top level pivots here, and let us go to um, okay, let us go to ISO 23894 and let us also look into the NIST AI RMF here. So the NIST AI RMF pivots are govern, manage, map, and measure, whereas the SR 11.7 pivots are model development, implementation, use, validation, vendor management, and governance. So what this particular crosswalk is doing is it's saying which of these top level pivots would match the top level pivots here. And then within that particular pivot matching, we would also try to look at an equivalence of the controls which are here under, for example, governance, and the controls that are here under govern in NIST AI RMF. So this is what the crosswalk is doing here. So with that particular context again, here you see that you have the NIST AI RMF top 4 pivots: govern, measure, map, and manage. We already saw ISO 23894, and now you see the specific sections for SR 11.7 as well. So you're now in a position to understand what does it mean to have this particular crosswalk across different functions, across different controls in different frameworks. And sometimes one of them is a one-to-one mapping. That's quite rare, to be honest, or mostly it will be a one-to-many mapping here. Now, um, taking this one step forward, if we now abstract it away from just the top level pivots that we have just seen, 23894, NIST AI RMF, and 11.7 here, the tool categories very broadly put are either governance and ethical oversight, or risk assessment and validation, and risk treatment and monitoring. This is a summarization purely based on convenience, just to communicate the specific point here about what tools can we use for satisfying some of the categories and the requirements in these frameworks. So some of the representative tools here for governance and ethical oversight are Z-Inpex inspection, the Canadian AIA, and some generic GRC platforms as well. As we said, you could always start off with a simple Excel sheet based on your immediate requirements and then work your way up all the way to a very powerful GRC platform here. The same goes now. These tools will be in a position to help cover these particular clauses in ISO 23894, or these particular pivots in the NIST AI RMF, or these particular sections in SR 11.7. Now, I'm sure that you would have seen back in AI in the Reg Experience main screen, which is for the AI risk management. There are a number of other templates that we have put in here as well. So there is one around Microsoft Responsible AI Standard. There are responsible AI guidelines based on an academic paper that was published earlier. There is also the Model AI Governance Framework for Generative AI based on Singapore IMDA as well. So again, if you click on this, you will see a similar set of govern, map, manage, and measure. That is because the model governance framework in Singapore is also closely following the NIST AI RMF. So the pivots are relatively the same, and that is meaningful in terms of the current context. So with respect to this, the relevance of having these different AI frameworks is you could always add additional columns here. You have NIST ISO, you have ISO NIST SR11, and you can keep on adding additional columns for every framework that you have, and either do a crosswalk or do an independent analysis as well. However, the main takeaway point is for each of those categories and for each of those controls that are there for those frameworks, these are some of the representative tools that you can still use to go ahead and show requirements or compliance to those requirements in some meaningful way. So again, in this particular case of governance and ethical oversight, we have Z inspection, Canadian AIA, some GRC platforms. Risk assessment and validation, we talked a lot about this in session 2, so we will not redo that, but again we talked about AIF 360, Fairlearn. We did not talk about SHAP and Lime, though they are prototypes that had been published by Microsoft, and actually they are in production as well based on their responsible AI framework, the dashboard, so to speak, and then there is full box as well. And then for risk treatment and monitoring, you can also think of GRC platforms as one representative tool set. This particular table is not meant to be exhaustive, and the idea here is to know what are all possible and what are all useful in terms of these categories. However, as we talked about in session 2 as well, um, you don't need to use all these tools for these categories, and even more importantly, you don't need to use all of the controls in a given framework as well. Context is king, so it really depends upon what your use case is and what is the actual perceived risk as a consequence of the application of your AI scenario or the way you are applying AI in your product. Again, I'll pause here for just a minute to see if there are any questions or comments. I don't see any right now, so I'm just going to move on. If you have any questions, do please feel free to put them in the webinar chat or the Q&A as well. So now the usage of this is the other important aspect. The frameworks of these AI risk managements needs to be applied in context. So we saw all the number of frameworks that are already there in Reg Experience. And as an example, if you look at the general list here, the supervisory guidance on model risk management, if you recall, session 1, we talked about how HSBC is using that in Singapore for some of their customer management and loan management use cases. So they had developed one particular AI model, and in order to understand how it performs, they had used the supervisory guidance on model risk management. This is available in the Singapore GovTech use cases as well. However, they did not use either ISO 23894 or 42001 or the NIST AI framework or any other framework. And that is simply because that is what their particular use case called for. So they made a judgment call to use this particular supervisory guidance, specifically because they are a financial company, and this is much more specific to a financial company in the United States. So that is the context in which all of these applications need to be done. Very specifically speaking then, within this context, we had the frameworks of AI risk management. They need to be applied in the context of the product or the scenario that you're delivering. And more importantly, even if you choose, let us say, the NIST AI RMF or ISO either 42001 or the actual risk management, not all scenarios need application of all the requirements. It could simply be that only some of the requirements are actually applicable, and some of them are just not applicable based on the scenarios. So again, you need to focus on the specific context when you're applying any of these ones. The third point is the needs also vary. So we have been talking a lot about ISO 23894. So 42001 is the artificial intelligence management systems, and that is a certification. However, ISO 23894 is the artificial intelligence risk management guidelines, but that is not a certification, but it tags along with 42001. So if you sort of satisfy 23894, most of the documentation and the work that you have done there will sort of just tag along and will help you complete 42001 as well. So it really depends on what your specific need is in terms of the work that you're doing and the societal impact or the actual product level impact that you have here. NIST AI RMF goes without saying is voluntary. And this is also something that we had covered earlier in terms of what are the voluntary items and what are certification based. So far, 42001 is certification. The EU AI Act is something that is required by law to be followed. And that really depends on whether you're doing anything regarding what is called a high risk area. Otherwise, any of these applications or certifications or EU AI Act or the executive orders coming in from the White House, they are all going to be dependent and they will evolve based on the context and how the technology is also going to evolve as well. So this is the point on the usage. So the reason I'm setting context here is in the next slide, we are going to see a very rough power flow chart on when you can try to apply a particular framework and what sort of tools and others would you be would you want to apply based on your particular needs as well. The examples in that, and again, they are not comprehensive nor are they prescriptive. The examples there are relegated only to 23894, NIST AI RMF, and 42001, but and SR11, of course. But that is not holistic as well. So it is just something to be put in context before we actually go ahead and try to see what the usage criteria is. So give me just a minute. I see. Okay. So now let's look at the usage context here. I'm going to see if I can zoom in so that each of these are very clear. So we are going to start and we are going to evaluate if you are in a public sector. And if yes, the framework of getting into the NIST AI RMF plus trying to understand it from 23894 would be very good, because 23894 is a bit more specific in terms of what needs to be done there. So this is the recommendation in terms of the framework. The tool set here is any kind of governance GRC, and then you can use AIF 360, FairLearn, and others to try and understand how that particular technicalities are working. Now, I did very clearly say these are examples. So the tool set or the frameworks are not prescriptive guidances. They are just merely some sort of guiding principles based on what we have discussed so far. We very briefly talked about the Canadian AIA. We just have a couple of slides after this, which I will also walk through. So the Canadian AIA is mandated in certain conditions. So you also need to evaluate if the AIA is mandated. If yes, you go ahead and add on the framework for the Canadian AIA. Now, although this particular statement says the framework add-on is the Canadian AIA, Canadian AI is less of a framework and more of a questionnaire that helps you get to a certain outcome here. And finally, of course, you can do the toolset add-on of the AIA portal or some sort of a transparency page as well. And if it is not mandated, it really depends. You can choose not to have it and just go ahead and have it as an internal checklist if you would so wish to. So this is the overall structure of how the decisions can be taken in terms of what kind of framework to use and when to use them as well. So if you're not of public sector and if you're a financial sector, there are some additional frameworks that you can use, and there is a bit more of a tool set recommendation here, simply because you are a financial institution. But again, the key point to note here is that in a financial institution, there isn't just one scenario. There are multiple scenarios, maybe hundreds and even more. So you really need to take it on a scenario level and see whether the model needs to be applied in that particular session or not. And finally, here you also want to check if you're operating in a high risk or a safety critical item. And if yes, you want to do the Z inspection trust audit, which will help you understand the ethics of what your particular scenario is delivering here. If no, you can choose not to apply it or even take the Z inspection just on an internal note as well. The final decision box is if you're selling in the EU or if you're in enterprise procurement, having these kind of frameworks or even a certification. And again, remember, this is just in the context of 23,894, but 42,001 is the actual certification that you can get. And getting that kind of a certification will also help in the enterprise procurement cycle as well. So again, we are going to be sharing this slide, so I will not go through each one of those branching points here. So the financial institution, no, you can then think about it from an organizational standpoint. If the size is micro or under 50, there is something that you can do here based on the procurement you would like to do. And if you're an SMB from 50 to 250, something different here. And again, the tool set is something you can use either, you can use Reg Experience itself for governance or something like Jira approvals or Notion or any other sort of a tool set that is working for you in that particular context. And of course, you also have to evaluate if from an organizational standpoint, you need to do this on a repeatable basis. Doing it in a tactical manner is meaningful when you need to do it just maybe once. But if you're going to do it on a repeatable basis, and that is the mainstream or the mainline of your product suite, having some sort of a formal governance toolset is probably very useful there. The mid markets or the enterprise, you probably need to understand larger GRC tool sets like ServiceNow, Archer, or there are a lot of others there as well. And even try to understand whether you're in a position to monitor the weights and biases or even look at explainability or observability. The reason they are sort of mentioned here, but lesser to a lesser extent on the top, is developing our own model based on data that you already have, and doing that is a much more involved work. So, but it's not unlike that an SMB or a startup cannot do that. So as an SMB or a startup, if you are going to be doing that kind of a model update or weightage, you can still go ahead and start using observability tool sets that you need to look into there. So this is the usage context. On a final note, we are just going to very quickly cover the Canadian AIA toolset and the Z inspection. These are the two ones that we did not talk about very specifically in session 2. So it is probably meaningful to talk about them in this context here. So what is the Canadian AIA? It was introduced by the government of Canada, and it's mandatory for the federal systems that are affecting the public. There are a number of examples there and case studies. For example, Singapore already does that as Singapore GovTech AI case studies, and this is what Canada has been doing as well. So in this particular use case, they had tried to understand the disability benefits AI used before deployment. So the idea here is that this was classified as level 3 impact, which means that high accountability. As is useful most of the time, the mitigations is both peer review and human in the loop. Human in the loop particularly is being used as a mitigation for most of the AI systems, very specifically for the ones that are LLM based, but really depending on the kind of use case that you have. So if you have a use case where you're using an LLM to do interviews, a human in the loop is probably very useful, and some would argue all definitely required. However, if you're going to be just using it for summarization or trying to help you in crafting an email or a LinkedIn post, the human in the loop is not required from the actual company standpoint, but the human in the loop still happens as a consequence of you as a user reviewing the output before actually using it. So here, in this particular case, for the example that is shown here, the bias risks were identified and corrected very specifically for some rare disability data gaps. And this really implies some of the data is not available, or it's just so sparse that you don't really have sufficient training data here. Again, the key lesson, which is what I found really useful in this particular context, is it operationalizes the AI ethics, right? So it's a very difficult process to take the notion of ethics and operationalize them. And that is what this particular AIA case summary says they were able to do so. So that is quite important, especially when you're operating at a very large scale as well. This is a set of the examples and the publicly available tool sets and the links as well. So once you get this tool deck, you can go visit this particular website and understand a bit more about what they have been referring to. The next one that we would like to very briefly talk about is this notion of Z inspection. And the idea here is that you want to understand trustworthy AI assessment. So this is effectively an audit method for evaluating trustworthiness. And what it evaluates is performance, robustness, and fairness, but mostly through a questionnaire based and an introspective method based. The when to use is, it's trying to list what all particular sections are useful. But the idea is when you have something that is a high impact AI, or when you have something that is very safety critical, that is the point when you want to be using this kind of a tool sets. So here, the way it is being executed is it's trying to understand the scope and the independent setup, and whether you have the right checks and balances in place for the execution of the AI models or the AI systems that you have. Um, and again, the way to integrate that is you can again map the outcomes to the NIST AI RMF functions, the govern, map, measure, and manage. And you can do this for the ISO 23894 as well, using the similar crosswalk strategy that we previously talked about. So in this context, the this is a bit more of a deep dive into what the Z inspection is. So due to lack of time, I will not be going through this, but again, you'll have access to the deck. So you should be in a position to look into it. But the case study is actually quite relevant and interesting. So what the particular case study did was they were trying to audit the AIs that were being used to detect a cardiac arrest during emergency calls. So you can already see by the nature of the use case that this is safety critical. And in this particular case, they conducted this inspection over a 6-month period, and the evaluation covered both technical accuracies and some notion of ethics, law, and the social impact as well. Some of the findings was the AI improved the response times, but it struggled with noise and dialects. And the most important part was the human in the loop again was always kept in there, so that you could always step in and start helping people depending on the nature of the call as well. Another part is about the transparency. Here, the public is informed that AI is supporting but is not replacing the dispatchers. And that is absolutely required based on the safety critical nature of this particular use case here. Um, the outcomes again, they were recognized as one of the best practices and set a national model for ethical AI development and deployment, which is actually quite impactful when you think about the notion of ethical AI deployment, so to speak. Finally, the lesson here is that you need to catch these ethical and human factors early, because if you do go ahead and deploy something that is not really ethical, or cannot actually understand specifics in a safety critical area, the impact could be, very undesirable, to put it mildly. So uh, to conclude here, the key takeaways is not one size fits all. The frameworks that we have talked about here is just a smattering, but they are also the very important ones. 42001 is important. 23894 is a very core part of it, And the NIST AI RMF is always quoted whenever you talk about AI RMFs as well. If you are in a high stakes position that your scenario is going to be addressing, the proactive risk management will definitely pay off. The context is king, so figure out what particular framework is meaningful for you, and even within the framework, figure out what kind of requirements are meaningful as well. Embedding and iterating culture and training and looking ahead, these are generics which are applicable to almost every initiative, but the looking ahead is very, very relevant in this particular context, because the expectation is AI risk governance will likely become much more, prescriptive, and will become much more relevant as the application of the AI LLM systems that we have today, it starts taking off in a much more scalable manner beyond just documentation and summarization and others. Once it starts taking off into safety critical areas, it will be really useful there as well. So with this, folks, I'm going to stop the sharing and the conversation. I will now look into the chat if anybody has any questions or comments as well. Happy to have a quick discussion as well based on any questions that you might have. Thank you again for your time. All right, folks, I think there aren't any more questions here. So we will now close the session, and I will see you in the next webinar that Deep Dive Labs is conducting. Thank you again, folks. Bye.